Okay, I think we're live maybe. Is it coming on here? Dun, dun, dun. All right, cool. Alrighty, we're live. Hey everybody, good to see you again. Today I wanted to jump on here to do a live stream to talk about a research study that I saw pop up on my social media feed today. And I was like, well, we need to do more practice of live stream, so why not hop on here and talk about this study and see what happens. So real quick, let me get my screen shared, and we're going to go through the study bit by bit. I'll break it down, and then I'll give you my thoughts on it and go from there. And thanks for being here. Dirty the Grower. I appreciate you hanging out. Let's see. Let me get my screen shared. Bear with me for just a second. Okay, here it comes. Okay, so we should have this High Times article up now. And forgive me if you talk to me in the chat. I won't be able to see it for a little while. So this article came out recently, yesterday, and I saw it circulating social media, and I could already see some problems with how some of this data might get interpreted, and so I just wanted to talk about it a little bit and share my thoughts. Basically what's going on is a research study was published very recently that found that terpene levels, and particularly overall terpene concentration of a few key terpenes, seem to be associated with better outcomes compared to other products that had less terpenes or didn't have these specific terpenes. So that's exciting research. A lot of people want to understand how the entourage effect works, how terpenes might contribute to, those sorts of things. So I know that this research study is going to get a lot of buzz, if you will. So let's go into it. So the High Times article, and then we'll go into the actual scientific study. It says, a new study from researchers at the University of New Mexico found that for medical cannabis patients seeking the most effective symptom relief, it all comes down to terpene levels. The research published in the Journal of Cannabis Research found that symptom relief was greatest after consumption of plant variants with slightly higher than average levels of the terpenes myrcene, terpinolene, and non-detectable levels of CBD. So, immediately this is basically saying that folks were getting the most relief from things that had as much THC as possible, as little CBD as possible, and myrcene and terpinolene, which immediately I find interesting. I'll share my thoughts later, but anecdotally, I have several stories that relate to this that make me pause when I read that. In contrast, chemovars with any detectable levels of CBD provided the least relief, the fewest positive side effects, and the most negative and context-specific side effects. These findings are consistent with previous research showing that naturally abundant CBD in cannabis flower may act as an inhibitor of optimal treatment for certain health conditions, such as gastrointestinal pain. In their conclusion, they wrote that their findings provide quote-unquote proof of concept that a simple yet comprehensive chemovar indexing system can be used to identify systematic differences in clinically relevant patient health outcomes and other common experiences across cannabis flower products, irrespective of the product's commercial or strain name. So immediately, this gives you a sense of what the point of this paper was to see whether a system can be applied to organize cannabis products based on their terpene profiles and cannabinoid profiles, and whether that can be correlated with therapeutic outcomes. So this is interesting when you read, when you first read through this. This is very interesting, but whenever you're reading an article, reading about science in a pop culture setting, I really just encourage you to go to the primary source. These are excerpts that are being pulled out of the study, and someone is providing a bit of their own narrative here. So let's go look at the study ourselves and see what we think of it, and then I'll talk about my thoughts. So here's the actual study. I'm going to check the chat real quick here. Cool. Awesome. Glad you're with us. And for the rest of you viewing, thanks so much for joining. So this is the actual study, systematic combinations of major cannabinoid and terpene contents in cannabis flower and patient outcomes, a proof of concept assessment of the Vigil index of cannabis chemovars. So one immediately assumes that the Vigil index of cannabis chemovars must be something that Jacob Vigil came up with. I do not know Jacob Vigil. I know a lot of people in the cannabis research space, but I don't know that person. That doesn't mean anything. I just don't know who they are. So I don't know how credible they are or what this index of cannabis chemovars is. This is new to me. And Jacob, if you happen to ever see this, let's talk about this on the podcast. So let's read through a little bit of this study. So the background that's provided, it says, little is known about the frequency with which different combinations of phytochemicals or chemovars arise in cannabis flower, or whether common chemovars are associated with distinct pharmacodynamics and patient health outcomes. This study created a clinically relevant, user-friendly, scalable chemovar indexing system summarizing primary cannabinoid and terpene contents and tested whether the most frequently consumed chemovars differ in their treatment effectiveness and experience side effects. Cool. So, like I said before, the goal seems to be, can we organize cannabis plants by cannabinoid and terpene content and relate that to therapeutic outcomes and better understand which products to use for what conditions? It's almost like a holy grail in medical cannabis, of trying to be able to get people away from strains and indica sativa designations and really focusing on just what's the chemistry of the plant and what therapeutic outcomes, can be expected from that chemical profile. Again, I will give you my thoughts at the end, but there are some philosophical issues with that way of thinking. So let's look at the methods before we get into the results. So how did they conduct the study? How did they figure out whether this chemovar indexing system could be used? And if you don't know what the word chemovar is for any reason, chemovar means chemical variety. It's a concept that kind of arose from Arno Hazekamp in the early 2000s. I have a Curious About Cannabis podcast interview that's like almost 3 hours long with Arno that I really recommend you check out, where we talk about where the concept of chemovar came from and how it applies to cannabis, how it's different than the concept of a cultivar or a strain and that sort of thing. And all a chemovar is it just refers to any time you organize any varieties of something by chemistry. Then that thing is a chemovar, that sort of bucket that it falls into for whatever traits you're associating with it is some chemovar. Some people don't seem to like that concept, but for clinicians and pharmacists, chemovar is a very important concept. So anyway, how did they do this? So it says between September 10th, 2016 and March 11th, 2021, so quite a bit of time, 5 years, 204 people used the freely available educational mobile software app Relief app to record 6,309 real-time consumption sessions using 633 distinct cannabis flower products. So immediately, what we have to recognize here is the data coming in to support this study is coming through this app that's collecting information from users. And it sounds like, and I'm sure we'll find out more as we read, but it sounds like this app is kind of like a journaling app where you're inputting the products you're using and the test results and things associated with it. And then doing a survey probably before and after consumption to chart what happened, which is cool. I mean, apps like that, that's pretty cool. I am glad people are using apps like that. I personally prefer to journal and write things down. I tend to remember things and process information better when I write it. So I'm still kind of old school and use real journals. But it's cool that people are using these digital tools to keep track of their experiences and find what works best for them. So 204 people, that's a fair amount of people. Like to see it in the thousands, especially when it's over the course of 5 years. 204 users seems low to me, but maybe there were exclusions in that. I don't know. I also don't want to. I don't know. I don't want to be an asshole. Like, oh, you only had 200 users on your app in 5 years. So I'm not trying to come across that way, but it just seems a little low, giving the date range. But I don't know how they included people in this study or excluded, and maybe they'll tell us. And let's see. So we've got over 6,000 sessions representing 200 people. I wonder if it'll tell us some statistics on that. Like, what if there's one user who was recorded like 6,200 sessions, and then the others only recorded a few? That would certainly introduce a big bias in that one person's reporting would greatly skew the data. So you can kind of see the questions that are running through my head as I'm reading this. I'm just trying to understand what the data is, what's going on. Real quick, I want to just check the chat, make sure everything looks good, make sure the live stream's still running good. Cool. Getting back to this, so we've talked a little bit about the methods, some of my questions about that. Let's just dive into the results. So the results say, examination of the 5 most frequently consumed chemovars showed significant differences in symptom treatment effectiveness for chronic pain and for depression and anxiety. While the effects varied in magnitude, the 5 chemovars were effective across conditions except for MC61. Now, the chemovars, I want to understand. It says that they indexed all these and found a total of 478 distinct chemovars. I really want to understand how those distinctions were made. Is that based on concentrations or ratios? That sort of thing. Because that's a lot of chemovars, and I'm not surprised. There's a lot, but I just want to understand what a distinct chemovar is. Very specifically. The 5 chemovars were effective across. I guess part of this is confusing me. While the effects varied in magnitude, the 5 chemovars were effective across conditions except for MC60. Okay, these are just the 5 most frequently consumed chemovars. Okay, so out of these 478 chemovars, they narrowed in on 5 of them that people used the most. So I find that a little interesting too. While the effects varied in magnitude, the 5 chemovars were effective across conditions except for MC61, myrcene, beta-caryophyllene, THC, CBD, which exacerbated feelings of anxiety or depression. Okay, well, that can be for a variety of reasons. The chemovars also differed in their association with experiencing positive, negative, and context-specific side effects, with 2 chemovars, MC61 and MC62, which had, 61 and 62. I'm trying to figure out the differences. I hope there's a chart. Before I worry about all of this crap, that's not nice. I shouldn't say that. It's not crap at all. There's a lot to unpack here that, we need some charts. I need to understand what in the world these things are. So here are the 5 chemovars that were most commonly used that this article is referencing. Let's see if they Okay, the primary terpenes. So in this first one that they call LM60, which I assume they called it LM because of limonene, says it has limonene as a primary terpene, myrcene as a secondary terpene, though the concentration ranges are the same, and high THC, no CBD. Then this next group has primarily myrcene with alpha pinene, no CBD, a little less THC. But I don't know, man. I just have some questions. Myrcene, beta caryophyllene in this third group, which makes sense. I mean, beta caryophyllene is one of the most common. Myrcene and beta caryophyllene are the most common terpenes in cannabis, and beta caryophyllene typically shows up as a dominant terpene if cannabis has been allowed to dry for a while, because once those monoterpenes start to volatilize off, your concentrations of sesquiterpenes increase naturally. So I don't know. I have a lot of questions around these products, how they were treated, and how that influenced the data that comes out of this. But let's move on. 4, we've got myrcene, beta caryophyllene again. The only difference here is that this group has a little more CBD. Oh, okay. And then terpenylene and limonene in the last group. No CBD. It's just really... I have so many thoughts in my head that I'm having trouble getting any one of them to come out. But anyway, so now we understand what these chemovars are. We've got limonene, myrcene, no CBD, high THC. We've got myrcene, alpha pinene, no CBD, high THC. We've got myrcene, beta caryophyllene with a little bit of CBD. We've got myrcene, beta caryophyllene with a little more CBD, and we've got terpenylene and limonene. And this represents what most people were using in some form or another. Okay. So at least we understand that. So that will help us digest some of this information a little better. So the conclusions say the findings provide proof of concept that, so this is what we read on the High Times page. The study was limited by self-selection into cannabis and app use and a lack of user-specific information. Okay, so the information was, I guess, anonymized or stripped from any specific users. So these are important limitations. And when you're writing a research paper to publish as a scientist, you're supposed to acknowledge your limitations. So I'm really glad they did that here. Because if they weren't going to do it, I was going to. And this shows me that, at least the authors of this understand that this data has quite a few kind of biases built into it. First of all, it's based on surveys. And I'm going to go ahead and we'll come back to this if we need to, but I'm going to go ahead and switch back and get my camera on here. So let's see, we should be back now. My stream is glitching right now, so I don't know if it's actually still running or not. If it is, throw me a thumbs up in the chat so that I know that it's actually still coming through. It should be showing my camera now, but I can't see anything. Let's see. What about that? Is it working? Welcome, Hanson Farms. Thanks for joining us. I hope that the stream is actually working. I hope you can actually hear me. I'm dealing with a little glitch right now, and I don't actually know if I'm showing up. Loud and clear? Okay, good deal. Can you actually see me, though? Because I'm trying to make sure the video and audio. Okay, great. Thanks. I'll just trust you. So Some of the biases built in to this study. One, it's survey research, survey research is really interesting. Um, it's important to ask people what they're experiencing and to get that feedback. The problem is that survey research has inherent biases that have been really well studied. First of all, survey research, you're only getting data from people that tend to take surveys. There are lots of people that do not like to sit down and answer questions or don't want to share their information, that sort of thing. So anytime you read a research paper where the data is based in survey data, you always have to be careful. And it doesn't mean that the data or the conclusions that the authors make are off, but it just means you need to ask a few more follow-up questions to understand how robust the data set is. So in this case, they had, over the course of 5 years or so, 200 users, approximately 204, I think it said, 200 users use this app. And over that I want to keep emphasizing how long of a period of time this was. Over 5 years, these 200 users produced over 6,000 session reports, journals that have information about what products they used and what the cannabinoid content is, what the terpene content is, etc. And that data, and I'm going to dive into this and make sure, but based on what we've read so far, it seems like that data was then extracted and divorced from the users so that you just have these data points and they're not associated with users at all. So that potentially is a problem. Not necessarily, but potentially. So what goes through my mind when I think about that is, well, like I mentioned before, when the data points become divorced from the users, then we have a concern that how much of this data set is biased by a small proportion of those users. Essentially, 200 users produced these 6,000 data points, but on average, how much did each user contribute to? Because it's almost certainly not even. I would guarantee you, there are users that sign up for the app, maybe use it once and never use it again, and you've got people that use it regularly and everything in between. And I'm going to keep diving into this to see if they answer that question. I'm not sure yet, and I want to be very clear about that. I'm trying not to jump to any assumptions, and I'm trying to just talk through my thought process as a scientist reading the study, what's going through my mind, and how am I making sense of the information. So we're not jumping to any conclusions yet. We're just asking questions. And so the questions I have are, how were people found to sign up for the app? Because that's a bias. Were these people at colleges? That's a bias in terms of, not necessarily representing the average person. Or was this done in clinical settings in hospitals, et cetera? Was it just social media, word of mouth? How were people recruited to use this app? That's question one. Question two, like I mentioned, what was the average contribution per user on the app so that we know how these data points relate to that population? Because I do worry that the data set is biased towards probably like 20% of those users, because I'm just thinking kind of the 80-20 rule. It is often the case, and I know this from running my own app and websites, social media accounts, and everything. You have this core small group of people that tend to actually engage regularly, and then you have a whole bunch of other people that just kind of linger. And they may be signed up, maybe they downloaded something or whatever, but they're not really participating. So that's a question I have. Beyond all of that, what I wonder about is how the data, the chemical data associated with the products, was validated. And I actually want to dive back into the study now to try to answer that question, because it's a really big one. So if any of you watching don't know, my background was still is, in analytical chemistry of natural products, trying to look at plants and mushrooms and understand what chemicals are in them and how those chemicals can be used to make food and dietary supplement products or even pharmaceutical drugs. Just basically trying to understand that chemistry, what's in there. And also, specifically, I'm interested in, sort of the ethnobotanical side, but also the ecological side. How does the organism use these chemicals to interact with its environment? So I'm very interested. I know that terpene data in the cannabis space in general is not very reliable. And I say this because most labs, when they're getting started in the cannabis space, there are a lot of pressures to act fast and develop methods that are as quick as possible for high throughput. And most of these labs, based on my experience, having visited a lot of them, having managed over 5 of them, it is my experience that typically labs will not go through rigorous method validation for an analytical method unless it's required for their compliance testing work, required by regulation. The reason for this is because labs are usually so swamped and stressed out that they simply don't have the time, energy, and resources. They're also operating on a razor-thin budget, most of them that are at least doing things the right way. Most of them are losing money. So it's hard to engage in investigative R&D and develop robust methods for things that are actually not necessarily required by law. That's not to say all labs do this. There are some labs that go out of their way to try to kind of be on the cutting edge and support research and development more and do value that and invest time and money to validate things like terpene methods. However, most labs don't. So, what does that mean? That means that while you may be getting all these pieces of paper that have terpene data on them and you're seeing all these concentrations of terpenes, and it looks really nice and it gives you a sense that you know something, there's really no way to know whether that data is reliable or not, in the sense of whatever the lab prepared and ran and tested. We don't know if that data is reliable or not. We don't know if these labs are able to really distinguish between very similar terpenes. Terpenes are really, there's so many of them, they're so similar in weight and shape and size, that they can easily show up on a test mixed together and kind of just showing up as one compound when really you have multiple compounds. Also, terpenes show up as chiral compounds. They have kind of left and right hand versions, same molecular formula, same shape, size, everything, but they're just mirror images of each other. And these mirror images matter because they can have different effects, different aromas. It actually matters quite a bit. And it is really hard to validate not just a terpene method in general, but to validate it to the point that you can actually confidently distinguish between what's called the enantiomers of these terpenes, to separate the left hand from the right hand. It's not easy. It's not easy work. And a lot of labs, what they do is keep it pretty simple, and they just order reference standards for terpenes that contain 20 or 30 of the main terpenes that people tend to care about, which is funny because the terpenes people care about are primarily associated with what's available in reference standards for labs. So there's kind of a chicken and egg thing, because people are interested in what they read about, but what they read about is dictated by what reference standards are available for labs to use to test. And, it kind of goes on and on. But so there's this problem with terpene data. How reliable is it? Now, beyond just is the data reliable in terms of did the lab validate the method, and do they actually know their accuracy and precision for each terpene that they're reporting, and do their limits of quantitation go low enough that they're actually going to see a lot of the trace concentrations of some of these things? There's another problem, which is that terpenes change a lot. They change a lot fairly quickly. And so, depending on how cannabis is stored, depending on how it's handled, did you grind it up and leave it in your grinder for a while? Because if so, a lot of monoterpenes are going to be volatilizing out, moisture content's going to be lost, things are going to start oxidizing. There's a lot of chemical changes that happen in cannabis after that test result is issued. And so, and this is more the case with terpenes than it is with cannabinoids. There are chemical transformations that happen with cannabinoids, but cannabinoids are bigger chemicals. They're a little more stable. And so it just doesn't happen quite to the same degree. Terpenes, these, especially the terpenes that most people care about in relation to cannabis, because terpenes is one of the biggest chemical classes in nature. But the ones that cannabis folks are really specifically focused on are monoterpenes and sesquiterpenes. Monoterpenes, these are extremely small compounds and very sensitive compounds. They oxidize readily, they conjugate with other things and polymerize. All sorts of different things happen to these terpenes. So the test result for a product may be a biased data point compared to what someone actually consumed. That's my point. So I want to dive in here and see what I can find about the data. How was it produced? Were they just relying on certificates of analysis associated with these products, or did they have them tested? Since it's all app related, my concern is that this data is coming from something like Weed Maps or something, and let's just dive in and see. So real quick here, I'm going to check the chat before I backfeed on the audio. What about the location of the people who are using the application? Are they all across the U.S. or is it one state? Most of the stuff sold in Illinois do not have terps listed on the product, just THC content. Yeah, that's a really good point. Where you're located when you're collecting all this data definitely matters, and there can be biases associated with that as well. Real quick, I need to see what's going on with the feed because it is really having problems here. There we go. Okay, I got it fixed. And that's, it sucks that stuff in Illinois doesn't have the terpenes listed. It's just THC content. Something that I'm dealing with here in Mississippi, where I just recently moved back to. I grew up in Mississippi and lived in Oregon for a long time and just came back after they legalized medical cannabis. And the system here, you can't see the product, you can't smell it before you buy it. But they do actually have terpene data and cannabinoid data. But for all the reasons I just listed, nothing, in my opinion, the most important chemical data point from a certificate of analysis is the ratio of THC to CBD. After that, the main thing that I use to try to decide whether cannabis is good or not all comes down to organoleptics, meaning how does it smell, how does it feel, how does it look, how does it taste. So I much more would like to see research focusing on organoleptic qualities more so than these kind of test data points for a lot of the limitations that I've already highlighted. I'm going to go back here. Let me find a way to pull the study up, and we'll dive back into that here. So give me just 1 second. I'm still a little slow because I really need 2 monitors to do this all properly. But here we go. We're back in the study now. And let's see if we can figure out how all of this data came about. Methods. So here's the details of the methods. So bear with me for a second. The owner of the Relief app provided de-identified data to the investigators subject to a data use agreement. I wonder if the users of Relief app knew that that was going to happen, or if they knew that their data was going to be used. I'm not saying there's anything nefarious with that at all. I just genuinely wonder, because if I was a user, because I know most people don't read the use agreements, if I were a user of the app and then I saw this article come out, it's something I would want clarity on. So de-identified data, as a user, I would also want to know, like, well, how did you de-identify it? How do I know I can trust that? And I'm not trying to be too cynical or skeptical. This is just literally how my brain works. This is just what comes in. The freely available Relief app educational mobile software was designed to enable users to document the labeled characteristics of their cannabis products, blah, 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 dosing, route of administration, et cetera, et cetera. State legal cannabis product labels are required to include THC and CBD levels. Yeah, assuming you can actually trust them. Validation of these levels occurs through state-authorized cannabis testing labs, which commit fraud, with some of the labs also providing information on terpene concentrations. So, again, I'm sorry, I don't mean to be too cynical, but I give a whole hour-and-a-half lecture on how cannabis labs commit fraud and why cannabinoid levels on a lot of these state legal products, a lot of it's BS. And if I test it in my lab and try to see how things compare to the label, and I have several other colleagues around the world that do the same thing, and we all find that the product labels do not match what's really in there to varying degrees. So throw that out there. So they're saying that the data for cannabinoid testing is validated because it's coming from the state-authorized cannabis testing labs, which are accredited, and theoretically, the data for THC and CBD from these accredited labs should be validated. And according to paper trails and auditing records and things like that, it is. But also, we know it's bullshit. Like, we know that there are 45% THC numbers floating around on cannabis flower in these legal states, and it's not accurate. So that's a problem. Really, this data, in my opinion, this data is not validated. And there's clear evidence that it is not valid. Moving on. They also say, with some of these labs also providing information on terpene concentrations. Okay, this is a very light mention of where this terpene data came from because, like I just mentioned, most of these cannabis labs, while they may be validating their THC and CBD methods because they have to for regulatory reasons, in most states, they do not have to validate their terpene methods. So just because an accredited lab is producing terpene data, that doesn't mean that that terpene data is reliable at all. This is frustrating to me because this shows me that there is a slight misunderstanding or maybe too much trust that these researchers gave cannabis testing labs. And it sucks because you should be able to trust it. You should be able to trust the data coming out of these labs, no matter where they are in the country or the world, etc. But the reality is you can't. And I did an interview on the Casually Baked podcast not too long ago where the host, Joe, asked me about this issue. And my response, she said it was pretty depressing. But I want people to realize that the situation is pretty serious. It's like researchers are trying to pull this data and make some sense of it. And this data is going to be used by clinicians. That's going to then be used with patients. And most of this data is just not good enough yet to do that. And it's just frustrating. The potential terpenes available for entry in the app include alpha-pinene, beta-pinene, beta-caryophyllene, caryophyllene oxide, alpha-humulene, linalool, limonene, myrcene, ocimene, terpinolene, terpineol, alpha-phalandrine, alpha-terpenine, phenol, camphene, valencine, geraniol, guaiol, alpha-bisabolol, and farnesene. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So 20 terpenes, 20 out of, I mean, these are a lot of the majors, but 20 out of, hundreds. That is another limitation that we have to be mindful of. One reason why that matters, these lists often focus on the most dominant terpenes that show up. But again, remember, the terpenes we look for in cannabis relates to the availability of the reference standards that exist on the market. Studies that have been published in the past that talk about terpenes in cannabis largely rely on the reference standards that they can get. That's why you see the same terpenes often getting reported. There are researchers out there that apply mass spec and NMR to look at, large swaths of terpenes. Particularly if you look up research coming out of Israel from like Dadi Miri's lab, really great research looking at, 100 plus cannabinoids and hundreds of terpenes. That's where some of the, in my opinion, that's where some of the really serious chemovar research is really happening at the level that I would like to see it. 20 terpenes, this represents the, a lot of the most dominant ones that we think of as dominant based on what's been tested in the past. However, concentration does not always equate to efficacy. So some of these trace terpenes, they could matter. So that's another thing that's going through my head right now. The Relief app includes 52 health symptoms, 47 possible side effects. Okay, let's try to get deeper in here. So their data set was filtered. They had, okay, this makes a whole lot more sense. When I was first reading the data and I was like, okay, this app over 5 years only had 200 users. That's crazy. Okay, they had over 13,000 users. That makes way more sense. I apologize. I'm just getting over some bronchitis, so I still am coughing a bit if I talk too much. So they looked at the full data set. Then they focused on just data associated with flower. Then they found data associated with flower that had any available terpene information at all. Then they filtered that into sessions that included flower that had THC and CBD levels of less than 35%, which is, I don't know why they chose that limit. I need to understand what they mean by total THC and CBD cannabinoid family levels. Is that like total THC, like all tetrahydrocannabinols, or just total THC, THCA, and like post-decarboxylated THC? What throws me off is when they say cannabinoid family levels. Like family, that's typically considered a large class. And so are they saying that total cannabinoids need to be 35% or less? That'd make a little more sense to me. And then terpene levels, each less than 3%. So that's how the users were filtered. So they went from 13,000 users all the way down to only 200 users that produced data that had all of the variables filled in that they wanted to measure. And then, as you see down here, they had 6,000 sessions, basically 630 products across 200 users. I still have not seen any breakdown, though, of like the average contribution per user. Now, let's see if we can find any more information about the data and how it's validated. It kind of just... It's really a shame. It kind of just glosses over it. It seems like it's like they're saying, well, it's coming from the testing lab, so it's good. I also want to understand how users put this data into the app, because another bias that can come into a situation like this, because this is actually a little more complicated than a typical survey study, because you're relying on not just the users reporting how they felt, you're also having to rely on them to actually input the information correctly. So I really want to find any information that talks about how the data was put into the app. I think that's really important, but it doesn't seem like that's addressed anywhere. It kind of just goes straight from here into statistics and conclusions. Well, gosh. So let me just glance through here one more time and just make sure that there's nothing that addresses some of those questions I have. Let's look in their discussion and see if they talk about any of the issues that I've raised while I'm reading this. Let's see. There should be somewhere in here. I got to cough one more time. Sorry. I'll probably have to stop streaming soon so I can rest my voice. Well, this is interesting. It says the indexing system is validated as showing statistically and clinically significant differences in reported symptom relief for specific health conditions and differences in the side effects across the modeled chemovars. I think that's a pretty bold statement. I don't actually know that this system is validated in the way that they claim. At least I don't know that it's validated well enough for my liking. Okay, I don't see anything else going backwards, so let's move forward. By using information readily available on labels, the system enables clinicians, patients, and scientists to better customize and target flower products. Does it, though? The second aim of the current report was to test the research hypothesis that the distinct plant chemovars represented by our indexing system differ in their ability to treat health conditions. Interesting. In addition to validating the indexing system, the study is among the first to test for entourage effects from distinct plant variants on patient outcomes. Oh boy. Another pretty bold claim that I don't think the study actually supports. I hope I'm wrong, because this would be cool. These kinds of insights would be so helpful if they're accurate. I just can't confidently, I don't confidently feel like it is right now. While we only contrasted the effects of 5 distinct chemovars out of the over 400 they identified, they provided a proof of concept that the system, blah, blah, blah. Yeah, there's not... Okay, here we go. Here's where they talk about limitations. Are not without limitations. Yes, thank you for saying that. While having the potential to help guide future trials, the current study is limited by its observational nature and lack of a control group. Yes. Although the app is among the largest collections of real-time cannabis usage sessions in the U.S., it's limited by the information users have available to enter the app. Relatively few products offer full terpene concentrations, as these tests add expenditures and are rarely required. So look, they even admit these tests are rarely required by state agencies. So why would you assume that the data is valid? Because that means it falls outside of their accreditation scope, most likely. So when a lab is accredited, every method is not accredited. Only specific methods are accredited. And so you have a scope of accreditation. And if terpene testing is outside of that scope of accreditation, and there's not any evidence that it's been validated any other way, it is not a valid method, and that data is not valid. Even if the data is actually good, it's still not valid. It's tricky. The incompleteness of the data set is particularly constraining when the chemovars are analyzed at the most granular level. Yeah, I'm not sure the incompleteness of the data set is... Well, I mean, yeah, it is incomplete in the sense that all the data is not valid, or probably not valid. However, the system can be flexibly adapted to include overlapping properties and broader product distinctions. The current data set is also limited by its reliance on self-selection and self-reporting. Yes, that's number one. It's a huge bias, a huge limitation. It's possible that users may be excluded from the data set if they choose to no longer use the app. Likewise, individual level information about the cannabis users can be missing. They didn't even really explicitly say that the actual cannabinoid and terpene data that the users put in could be wrong. Finally, it's important to note that while the current coding system congregates the isoforms of THC and the isoforms of CBD together, the isoforms can have different blah, blah, blah. Yeah. Another thing this doesn't really acknowledge, there's several limitations that I don't think they really explicitly acknowledge here, which is one, the results showed that high THC, no CBD is helping all of these things, but is that just because the people using the app tend to use high THC cannabis? There's just so many questions that I have, and I'm doing this live stream and talking through this with you just because this study is going to make the rounds on social media. People are going to get really excited about this because they're going to read the headlines. They're going to read, oh yeah, entourage effects, and now we're linking chemovars to therapeutic outcomes, and we're moving into the next wave of cannabis medicine, and there's just so many holes here that need to be addressed. I think it's an interesting study. I think the thought behind it is interesting. I think that the indexing method itself could be valid, but without the chemical data being valid, that causes problems. And I think they made a bad assumption that data was valid, particularly in the context of terpenes, but even in the context of THC and CBD. So anyway, let me get my camera back on here and we'll start to close things out. I hope this has been interesting. It's important to think critically anytime you see these headlines around any scientific study. And, we want to see evidence of the effects of terpenes on therapeutic outcomes and how to make better decisions. But we've got to just be mindful in how we step into that, because we can get so excited about the possibilities of how to leverage technology to make better decisions about our health and the products we consume. But if that data is messed up in any way or biased, it can kind of send us in the wrong direction. And that's what I worry about with situations like this. I worry about patients that are working with a clinician who maybe doesn't quite understand all of the nuances around how some of this data is produced. And then they're guiding a patient in a way that actually wastes a little time or money or effort by trying to chase, a system rather than really carefully listening to the patient and working on a more individualized level to figure out what works best for them, not what a system tells them is going to work best. So these are my thoughts. Those of you that hung out this whole time, I appreciate it. This was fun. I hope to do more of these live streams like this as I see studies that come out that I find interesting or that I think maybe need a little bit of context. I'll try to do this more if you like it. I think that in doing this, maybe we can start to collectively hold each other accountable to think more critically about what we read and what we're processing, because at the end of the day, we all know from the good data that exists that cannabis has incredible potential. And we're all trying to figure out how to tap into that potential in different ways. And we just got to be careful that we do that mindfully and off of, good assumptions and data and conclusions that have, made it through rigorous criticism. It's important to criticize any science that comes out. That's part of the process. And then also, you always have to be careful about any studies you find like this one where, there's somewhat of an agenda here. A system was developed to try to figure out these correlations. And as the article described, the intent is to then get that system put into use by clinicians and things like that. And so there are potential biases and potentially even some variables, some things that might cause people that are tied into this project to overlook some of the nuance because they're so excited about this system and wanting to see it work. So that being said, I think that's about all I have to say about the study. Not a bad study per se. Like I said, the system, for all we know, maybe that system works really, really well. We won't actually know until it's put to the test with data that we can really feel confident about. And especially since a lot of that data goes back to like 2016, I would not trust a lot of the cannabinoid and terpene data that's on there. And that's not even to get into all of the other biases and potential problems related to just survey research. So cool study, follow it, read it. It's good to be familiar with, but when you see a lot of hype out there on social media about it, I hope that this will maybe help you raise some questions to help other people think critically about this data and what it actually means. Because science, a lot of people say science says this, science says that. Science says very little. Science is a tool that helps us critically evaluate our experiences and our ability to predict what happens in the natural world. Everything else relates to our perspectives and assumptions we make, conclusions we draw, and we always have to be careful. So with that, I'll check the chat real quick. Yeah. Oh, awesome. I'm glad that y'all hung around. So thanks so much for hopping in the chat. Let me know you're here. I hope you enjoyed it. And I'll try to do another live stream in the next few days or so. So with that, everybody, stay curious and take it easy. And I'll catch you next time. Bye-bye.